So without further ado, I will turn it over to you.
Thank you, dear. Yes, the title mentions both archaeology and epigraphy, and I'll just mention at the onset that the epigraphy that was available, the results of the epigraphy that were available to us in the 1970s were quite rudimentary compared to what's available today. So take that with a grain of salt. Okay. And this is not our field camp. Although something like that. Okay, I'm going to talk about the museum's project at Quirigua, which to some may seem like ancient history because it began 1975. Quirigua is located in southeastern Guatemala, not that far north of Copan, which is another familiar museum stomping ground. But Quirigua is especially well located in this valley in regard to some very critical commodities that the Maya traded and consumed in great numbers: cacao, chocolate, obsidian, and jade. In fact, we nicknamed the route that follows the Motagua River right by Quirigua as the Jade Route, not the Silk Route. A couple of views of Quirigua. The site, the main part of the site core, still has a cover of original tropical forest. The rest of the valley is pretty well denuded thanks to United Fruit. This is one of the major banana growing areas in Guatemala. Here's the Great Plaza, our excavations. The Motagua River, which we'll talk about in a minute, has left its signature all over the site, which is a considerable deposit and a renewable deposit. The latest renewable came with tropical storm just last year, and before that, Hurricane Mitch. So the site is constantly being flooded and new layers of silt added. And this is true in ancient times, which caused a bit of a problem in tracking down the settlement. A couple of views of the site. A new map that Chris Jones produced. The Great Plaza and the Acropolis. I'm going to talk mostly about the Acropolis, which is the royal residence for Quirigua. Here is a reconstruction by Instituto personnel working at the site. There is currently a small project at the site excavating the East Route, which just recently discovered some new sculptured panels and unfortunately badly eroded text on one of the buildings. Okay, a bit of history. Quirigua was first reported to the outside world by none other than Stevens and Catherwood in 1841. The description by Stevens here, a couple excerpts. It was then, and forever since, has been known for the size and elaborateness of the royal sculptures, the monuments, the largest known in the Maya world. So that was an attraction, and this was the first site that the famous British explorer archaeologist Alfred Maudsley visited. In fact, in his publication, he credits his first look at a Maya site and at Maya monuments at Quirigua as changing his career, changing his life to be devoted to Maya archaeology. This is then actually Alfred Maudsley's camp in the late 19th century at Quirigua, from which he photographed all the monuments and did some excavations, traces of which we were able to detect. And then there were a couple other projects that followed. most of them led by Sylvania Morley, beginning in the years before World War I, with a project sponsored by the Archaeological Institute of America and the School of American Archaeology, which is still headquartered in Santa Fe. That work not only did more excavations, but did actually the first attempts at restoration, of resetting of architectural walls. Morley was in charge of the restoration of structure 1B1, because it had a frieze as well as sculptured bench panels that were hieroglyphic inscriptions, and give a date, which is equivalent to 810 AD in our calendar. Here's Sylvania Morley next to Stela F. You can get some idea of the scale of some of these monuments. They're pretty immense. And then the Carnegie Institution of Washington, which was the dominant player in the research of Maya sites in the 30s and 40s, was here under the leadership of several characters in the history of archaeology. Earl Morris, and this is my favorite photograph of Gustav Stromsvik, the Norwegian sailor who was converted to archaeology by no less than Sylvania Morley, who is seen again here next to Zulmor P. This work was mostly involved both resetting and, of course, excavating the substellar caches, so the monuments were reset and the offerings beneath them were recovered in the 30s. There was also an excavation of the ball court at that time. But in looking back, as we did in the 70s, we realized that despite this work and valuable recording, especially by with the photographs of Maudsley, we still knew very little about Quirigua. The chronology was limited to the span of monuments that were dated by Morley of only a little over 100 years. Morley speculated that this site originated at Copan. He pointed to the similar planning of both sites, but Stromsvik took exception to that and said there was no relationship given the pattern of the ritual caches, which were very different. So in the early 70s, in fact, as one of the charges that I received when I was hired by the University of Pennsylvania in 1972, was to begin a new project. This is in the wake of Tikal, which was the American section's big show in the 50s and 60s. Bill Coe, who was then the curator of the American section, organized and planned this new project at Quirigua. And I was sort of recruited from the word go to be the field director of this project. I'll say more about some of this in a minute. The man who was behind all of this at that time, of course, and some of you may remember, is Froelich Rainey, Fro, who ran a tight ship here in the museum. If he wanted a project in Guatemala, which he did, he got one. The irony, I guess, being that in '76 was really when Fro visited our project, was really his last year as director. He was succeeded by Martin Biddle, who also visited the project while we were working. The major goals of our work were to do a comprehensive investigation of both the site and the surrounding settlement. There was also an important component that the museum didn't directly fund, that was funded by the Guatemalan government, to consolidate and conserve the site as well as its monuments. We wanted to begin by defining the occupation span And we had some hypotheses that we wanted to test. And one of them was Morley's old idea that it was a colony of Copan. We also wanted to see if there was evidence to directly support or refute the idea that this was here, that the site was here because of its trade importance in controlling the trade route of the Motagua River. This was our camp. It was a little more durable than Maudsley's. It even survived the 1976 7.8 earthquake. We were all here when it happened, and the epicenter of that earthquake was just a couple miles away. In 1975, we opened the project. Here is Bill Coe in his inevitable pink shirt addressing the assembled government officials. Luis Lujan, who is the director right here of the Institute of Anthropology and History of Guatemala at the time, formally opening the project. So, as I said, I'm going to talk mostly about the Acropolis, this royal center. Here's a view, air view of some of our excavations. It looks like we're pretty much tearing it apart, and I guess we were at the time. This is one of Bill's first trenches. In fact, here's Bill right in the center of the trench, just beginning on the west side. This is a later view. That's that trench underneath the cover there. This is just as it was beginning in '75. I think Bill long remembered Quirigua because he got to learn how to ride a motorcycle. I was very interested in the fact, as we began here, that there had been this article published several years before by David Kelly on the dynastic sequence of Quirigua. This was really the first, correct me if I'm wrong, Simon, but I believe it was the very first published attempt to actually define a dynasty of kings at a Maya site. And Kelly identified 3 kings, which he says here in his abstract, which he felt were fairly secure, and then he mentions 2 others which haven't really stood the test of time, but the 3 that he did identify have stood the test of time. Of course, he was not deciphering the text phonetically. He was following in the Berlin and Prost-Kirchhoff tradition of doing this by the context of the glyphs themselves and their association with emblem glyphs, which designate the site, and the idea then that the phrases associated with those should be the names of the actual rulers of that site. But I was fascinated by this. You can see I even got Thompson here on my desk. And wanted to make this project a kind of dual, simultaneous study of both the archaeology, but what we can also learn from the inscriptions. Bill Coe, my boss, was not enamored with this idea. He did not necessarily accept Kelly. Well, I can say he flat out didn't accept Kelly. So I had to wait at least 1 year. Bill was only there the first season in '75. Fro Rainey informed Bill after the first season that he was now going to stay home and write the Tikal reports. So I had more of a free rein starting in '76 and could then pursue that goal a little more. And I want to just mention one lady, Mary Ricketson Bullard, here she is. She was our laboratory supervisor, and I guess all projects need a surrogate mother figure, and she is certainly it. But the interesting thing is that she is the daughter of Oliver and Edith Richardson, who had excavated at Quirigua in the 1930s. They were Carnegie archaeologists. So she was coming home and she remembered Quirigua. She was like 4 years old at the time, but she remembered living in a little town of Quirigua, and tragically she had a childhood disease, tuberculosis of the bone, and she remembers being treated at the United Fruit Company Hospital at Quirigua in the 1930s. She ran a tight ship in the lab, let me tell you. Well, we started publishing the Quirigua research immediately after the final season in 1979 with the first 2 volumes of the Quirigua reports. As collateral programs to what we were doing in the Site Corps, we had 2 programs, the settlement program directed by Wendy Ashmore, and the Valley program, which was to identify and sample sites outside of Quirigua in the valley, directed by Ed Shortman. This was one solution to the problem of alluviation that covers especially the earlier remains. This is a late classic house. It's only covered by about 1 meter of alluvium, but the earlier stuff is covered by up to 2 or 3 meters. So Ed published his research in '93, dealing with all these sites. Here's Quirigua and its satellites. That's Quirigua itself. But all these other sites turned out to be very much in synchrony with Quirigua. That is, they rose and fell just about at the same time, in the same time frame as Quirigua, although in all their attributes they were non-Maya sites. They were very distinct. And Wendy's work traced the settlement immediately around Quirigua. Here is the Site Corps. This entire area was covered fortuitously by recently excavated drainage ditches excavated by the United Fruit Company or its successors, which at this time was Del Monte Corporation, which gave us an opportunity to actually get down into the deeper levels into the early Classic. That work also indicated that the original course of the Motagua at the time of Quirigua's occupation, here it is today, once was right here immediately west of the site, so that the site was actually built right along the banks. The main center was built right along the banks of the river. Wendy's research was published just a couple of years ago as Quirigua Report 4. Which brings us to Quirigua Report 5. This is a mock-up. We're not that far. But Chris Jones has been working on this for several years, right? A decade. And I joined the fray a year or 2 ago after I retired, and together we're putting, I think, the finishing touches, right, Chris?
Yeah.
Yeah, okay. The finishing touches on this report, and then after that, all we have is the artifacts and conclusions. Here's Chris as he looked as a young man in 1976 with Friend. So, it's been a 30-year gap between the excavation and the final report, which of course ain't published yet. But I was looking, in going through this manuscript, which was the original idea that behind this talk, is I was going through the findings that we had originally come up with in 1979 and in the next couple of years. And Chris and I wrote several articles together, and each of us did a couple by ourselves, in which we summarized our findings and conclusions about Quirigua. And I was contrasting those with what we're now talking about after working together on this report. And so what I'm going to do is contrast what we thought back then with what we think now. When we started work, basically, as I've already said, there was very little known about Quirigua. When we ended work, we did try to put together this picture based on both the archaeology and the history as it was then known. But now we have much more history because there's been much more decipherment both at Quirigua and at its neighboring site of Copan. And there's been more archaeological research, of course, mostly at Copan, and some recent work at Quirigua. So I'm going to go over 5 general topics of which we thought we knew the final word 30 years ago and show what we think about these today. I also will, of course, you will see the contrast between what I call a pre-laptop project, which Quirigua very much was, and today, where we have digital reconstruction and all of this technology that we can draw upon, which I console myself by saying that, well, if we published this 30 years ago, we wouldn't be able to do all this. Okay, origins of Quirigua. Well, back in the day, we estimated the beginnings about 450. There was a monument that was found in 1978 by the fruit company Dredge, but that we managed to salvage thanks to our foreman, Enrique Monteroso, who was doing consolidation. This happened in the off-season. And it turned out to be rather important because it actually gives the titles, at least, if not the names of 2 rulers, ruler 3 and ruler 4, has a date about 493. So we could project that perhaps the dynasty began around 450. That's about all we could do. Chris Jones, not with this monument, but with other monuments, well, including this monument, had looked at the stylistic similarities between the early monuments at Quirigua and pointed out their similarities with the monuments of Tikal, and from that postulated that Quirigua might have Tikal origins. Now, since then, decipherment has included a passage from this monument, Zoomorph P, which actually mentions the founder and the date of the founding in 426. And not only that, that would be Andrea Stone and Linda Shealy and Matt Looper. Not only that, but it includes the important phrase that this was done under the authority of the ruler of Copan, or the founding ruler of Copan, Kinichashbruk Mo. So that's a considerable upgrade in information. Simon has identified the name of that ruler, or a nickname, Talk Casper, and he's in several inscriptions. The subsequent archaeological work that we did at Copan indicates that the Copan founder could well have been from Tikal, or sponsored by Tikal, which then, at least indirectly, supports Chris's early idea that perhaps the Quirigua founder had something to do with Tikal, since he was actually sponsored by this ruler of Copan. But of course, this is all supposition at this point. Specifically, the origins of the Acropolis, the royal compound where we did most of our excavations. Back in 79 and 80, we were inspired to dig here by Marshall Becker, who had published a paper noting that the plan of the main Acropolis group here, structures on 4 sides of a central plaza, fit a template he had identified at Tikal known as Plaza Plan 2. And one of the significant attributes of this particular template is that the founder of the group, of the residences of these groups, is buried beneath a shrine on the eastern side of that group. So Marshall very kindly said, why don't you guys dig under that building? You'll find the tomb of the founder. Well, lo and behold, we did. We dug under there. Chris and I told Arlen Chase that he had to dig deep under there. And he found a burial, which we call prosaically burial 2, here it is, and he was the founder, or at least according to our suppositions even back then, although we had the date perhaps a little wrong, because we only had radiocarbon dates that went back about that far, directly associated with this. But a few years later, back in the 90s, I, inspired by Simon's work and others, thought that indeed if this is the founder, then indeed this might be not just any old founder, but Talk Casper himself. So that's again a possibility. And the evidence to support this is a revised and I think more accurate date for this material, because there is a radiocarbon date here, although it's not directly associated with a burial. It's associated with the floor that precedes the burial. The burial was intruded through this. It's not actually a floor, it's a ground level. And the date, calibrated date from this deposit is 205 to 405, which is reasonable if indeed the burial would be around 450, which is an estimated time of death, and only that. So here's the burial that produced the guy we labeled burial 2 that may indeed be the founder, under the very first of these eastern shrines, which is actually an adobe earthen platform. The later ones that succeeded are all masonry. Well, in the interim, of course, we had excavated at Copan, where we had found, much to our surprise, that many of the very earliest royal structures associated with the Copan founder were just like this. They were made of adobe. So that's another link, and it also collaborates the date, the estimated date. And there's another interesting tie. Here's the founder, or what we've identified as the founder of Copan in his tomb, Kanichiashkukmo, question mark, underneath a series of early shrines. But when we found this guy, I was immediately struck by the fact that he has the same kind of dental work that our guy in Quirigua had. So this is the guy in burial 2 of Quirigua, and here's the guy in Hunau. This is very rare at these sites. In fact, these are the only 2 burials that I know of at either Copan or Quirigua that have these kind of inlaid teeth. The other interesting thing is that when we did the neutron activation analysis of the pottery vessels from this Copan tomb, we found 2 vessels came from Quirigua. And so one might imagine, at least, that old Kanichiashkukmo kicked off before Talk Casper did, and these might have been his offerings to his sponsor's funeral from his own local digs. Okay. The next question is the Great Flood. As I said, this was first identified in the periphery of Quirigua. Here is a sketch giving the elevations of the different strata from Ashmore's Quirigua Report 4. What it shows is that the early classic level of settlement is here, or PTS 5, periphery time span 5, whereas the late classic is here. They're separated, even though they're, because of different elevations, not all at the same elevation, they're all separated by the same silt layer. And this is the silt layer from the Great Flood that intervenes between the early classic and the late classic. We had estimated this at originally sometime between 550 and 650. Here is one of these early classic structures. In fact, this is the structure where that early monument may have come from, which we estimate at about 500 CE, and it was buried by this silt as well. In going through the data, a fresh way, just a few months ago, I noticed, I had in my mind the idea or the conclusion that we had found this was a problem. We had not found this deposit anywhere in the site core, which is true. We don't find this same deposit, and I had concluded that the Maya must have removed it. But I didn't think we'd ever find evidence for it until I looked at this one section very closely, and I realized that this is the silt deposit preserved under this late structure. And right here is the cut, the end of that deposit where it has been taken away. And it's from this point on that we move out into the Great Plaza. This is on the edge of the Great Plaza. So it is there up to this point and preserved very well under this structure. But at some point, it had been removed from this point on, and this platform and this structure built over it. So here is kind of a smoking gun that actually shows what I had assumed must have been the case, that the Maya themselves had removed this deposit. And then I conjecture, I don't know if Chris agrees with this, but that's still, where did it go? Well, it probably went into the Acropolis when they were rebuilding it as fill. Of course, we'll never know. Anyway, the other side of this coin is, of course, that there was a full recovery from this, marked by an unprecedented scale of construction. And the Acropolis was completely rebuilt, and the most prominent, even the shrine gets a new version. This is added, or several buildings are added here. But the big addition is a new ball court, which is put on the west side of this complex. And here is Chris did the lower part of this excavation, and the western part. The original part over here was done by Biddle Co. But it was Chris that said, let's tunnel, and he's the one that found the ball court. Here he is tunneling right down one side of the ball court, into the playing alley, and he went far enough to find the other side over there. So there's his trench, right, or his tunnel. And there is a completely buried ball court, which we had no idea was there. So that was a rather imposing rebuilding of the Acropolis that comes as part of the recovery from the flood. And I also look at this monument, which we've known ever since Maudsley, that dates to 652, which would be right after this event, as perhaps reinforcing the recovery. I mean, this may well be originally have been part of the ball court, but it was found outside, so it had been taken away from its original place in ancient times. And decipherment since 1979 has shown that the individual portrayed here is a Quirigua ruler, Carrillo Yopat, but he names his overlord, who is the 12th ruler of Copan, on this monument. So the date of this, its theme of showing that Quirigua continues its allegiance to the kingdom of Copan, comes right at the beginning of this recovery. I didn't mention this, but one other possibility as to where this may date was also a recent discovery in the Greenland ice cores of a huge eruption of this volcano in Chiapas between 621 and 625, a rather precise date. And huge volcanic eruptions like this, which is upstream on the Motagua, could have created the conditions for a massive flood. But of course, that's something that we don't know either. Okay, and then we come to the great tragic theme of the relationship between Quirigua and Copan. Back at the end of the project, we knew, based on the work of Tanya Proskuriakov and Joyce Marcus in the 70s of two important events that were marked numerous times in the inscriptions at Quirigua. And these were associated with two rulers who had been identified at that time. 18 Rabbit, the 13th ruler of Copan, and the Quirigua ruler, so-called Calac Sky. And we, based on this work, it was concluded that this marked the defeat of Copan and the victory of Quirigua and its gaining a kind of independence from its former overlords. We couldn't read the text, but now we can. And the texts read pretty much according to this scenario, naming Washaklahun Ubakaiwil, the guy that used to be called 18 Rabbit, that in 724 he oversaw the accession of his vassal, the new ruler of Quirigua. Here is the actual Maya transcription of that text that I lifted from Simon's book. Here is, in his exaggerated status, the Quirigua ruler and the defeated former overlord at Copan. We can also read today that in 738, just a decade or more after the accession, the defeat is recorded repeatedly at Quirigua. Once at Copan, Simon, or yeah, about once. Only once at Copan, where they just say that our king, entered the water or something of that equivalent. They don't give any details, but he obviously is a goner. At Quirigua, they tell us that he was decapitated. And as a result of that victory, in which both the gods of the Copan ruler were captured and the ruler himself. So that's about as final as you can get in the Maya scheme of things. If you can capture both the personal gods and the individual, you pretty much wrap things up. Now, there was still an unsolved mystery. How did little Quirigua defeat Goliath here to the south? Because we knew from a population estimate that it was only 1/10 the size. It certainly couldn't call upon the resources, either manpower or anything else, unless one possibility was that it was done through some kind of, dirty trick, enticing the Copan ruler to come to Quirigua and then grabbing him or something. But then, just in the last decade, Matt Looper found a text at Quirigua which records a visit by the ruler of Calakmul 2 years before this. Here's Calakmul way up here. The ruler comes all the way here. Why would the ruler of Calakmul come all the way to dinky little Quirigua? Calakmul, which of course was one of the great powers of the Classic period, in the late Classic period, by this time was on its way down because it had been recently defeated by Tikal, but was still in the game, so to speak. So one possibility suggested by this is that this visit, if not intended for this purpose, may have included the alliance to help Quirigua defeat Copan. Another possibility, certainly no evidence, direct evidence for that. But it certainly makes sense and it would explain how Quirigua was able to muster the manpower to do this. We do know, and have known for the last 30 years, of the impressive aftermath, that after this event, Quirigua expands to an unprecedented size. The whole northern part of the Great Plaza is constructed around a new platform. So the plaza is expanded by 1/3 in the area. These buildings all date to this post-defeat or victory period. And the Acropolis is rebuilt as well. So the index of dramatically increased resources is there in the archaeological record. Today, of course, we can look at some of this digitally. Here is the way the Acropolis looked before the Axe event, as it's known. Here is the way it looked after. So there's been a considerable construction, including, since the ball court that Chris had found got buried by this new construction here on the west side, a new ball court is built to the north of this, and this entire platform here. So there was a considerable expansion of the Acropolis as well as the Great Plaza. These were done all by Fede Paredes that Loa mentioned earlier when he was helping us out with our three-dimensional reconstructions last year. So, the final two kings that are identified historically between about 785 and 810 or a little after that, the fellow is nicknamed Skyfuel, who is the guy on this monument that mentions the founding here, and his successor, who is named Jade Sky, who's on this monument, conducted further expansion. They were now in control of these resources. And in fact, the two largest buildings at Quirigua, Structure 1, which was built in 810, Structure 5, which was built about the same time, were both built by this guy. So at this point, it doesn't look like there are problems, but it's very soon after this that there's a rapid slide in the record, and certainly disappearance in the history of all these characters. And Copan, the royal authority system, as well as the occupation itself, disappeared. The final chapter is that as the site is falling apart, literally, and disintegrating, there is a brief moment of reoccupation by a new group of people who left behind some very different and very late artifacts, including copper bells, a sculpture which is often associated with the Terminal Classic or later. It goes from Chichen Itza all the way into Tenochtitlan, the Aztec capital. These are very atypical for late classic Maya sites, but these together with the pottery, which is very distinctive and very foreign, indicate that there must have been some kind of reoccupation, and these things are only found in a few places at the site. And the best guess is that they were here to try to keep this trade route alive. But after that, the forest takes over. So that's it. That's how things have changed in 30 years. Thank you very much. Oh, I do want to share
The Rogues Gallery.
the Rogues Gallery is if you can recognize John Weeks, Wendy Ashmore, Ed Shortman, Chris Jones. Here's Chris with our work crew, and here is Enrique Monteroso, our foreman. Over here, we got Arlen Chase, Diane Chase, Ed Shortman again, Chris again. Here's the only picture I have of Carl Bates. You may have noticed that many of the drawings, original drawings, were done by Carl, inked, the Englands. He came down in 1980 to check out to make sure our drawings were recording what was actually there. So, with that, if there are any questions, ask away. Thank you.